Hello listeners, I am your speaker Casey, and as many of you may know, I am currently undertaking the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University. I hope that this course will make me more informed and better equipped for future projects and interviews on the podcast. In the meantime, I will be releasing renewed versions of older episodes with updates from previous guests. If you want to find out what I remember from the time of each interview and get in-depth updates from the guests, I've been writing blog posts as I go through older episodes and adding them to my website, cultvaultpodcast.com, which you can also find links to in the episode description. You can find links on my website for support on navigating recovery from cultic abuse, to learn more about how to help a loved one, or become more informed about the subject of cults and coercive control. My emails are still open, and I am carefully curating a list of guests to speak with once I am back to interviewing officially next year. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch. And now, on to today's updated episode.
And does this lead to your father then signing the permission for you to become part of Ramtha in an attempt to regain some type of reconciliation with you?
Right. So what happened was, after this deprogramming and I finally escaped and made it back to Washington, I just told my dad, I'm not ever speaking to you again. You know, this was a betrayal and I felt horrible and, this unforgivable, and I would never speak to him again. And so that went on for a few months, I think. And then finally, my dad tried reaching out to me in different ways. And I think the final thing that what ended up happening, and where he sort of said he would consider giving me permission. So this was after the fall. At that point, I was 17 and I was learning to drive. And he basically made a deal with me and said, well, I'll tell you what, if I come out there and we go on a road trip, I'll come out there, spend a little bit of time with you, and I'd really like to take you on a road trip and we'll go places. And after that, if you still want my permission to go to the school, I will give it to you. And then I agreed to. And plus, we were going to go on a road trip, so I was going to get a chance to drive.
Yeah. So he's probably hoping that he can talk to you, reason with you, give you some distance from Bodenanda and your new friends and the love bombing and all of that. And in return, you're kind of thinking, well, nothing's going to break my will, so I'll get to go on this road trip with you. And when I get back, I get to go to the school.
Yeah. And it was a very risky thing for my dad to agree to, because, one thing about my dad is if he says something, he will do it. So he had to know that if this didn't work, he did really have to give me permission to go, as much as he didn't want to. I know he didn't want to, but I also know that he didn't feel like he could go back on his word after he had agreed that he would do that. So, we had a really nice trip, honestly, that I remember. It was fun, not without its sort of conflict, but ultimately, overall, I think it was a really nice trip. And by the end of it, though, it was just a nice way to connect, really. And, but at the end of it, I still wanted to go. And I remember distinctly going to this bank where my dad signed the paper, and then we had it notarized there so that I could present it to the school so I could go to the events. And another thing that prompted this, or I don't know, probably wasn't very influential, but I had sent my dad a letter saying, if you don't give me permission to go to the events, then I will never speak to you again. And I was almost 18. I was 17 and a half at that point. And so I was like, you'd be stupid to risk that. I will literally never speak to you again. And, so do the right thing and give me permission. And that's where I think my dad finally came up with that idea that we would spend some time together. And then if at the end of that I still wanted to, he would do it. He would give me the permission.
So you're really kind of putting him in a difficult situation by giving him those ultimatums, and he was probably trying to think of all the ways possible to just remain in contact with you, and so So, is it bullheaded? Is it that the expression where somebody's just not gonna change their decision?
Yeah, very. And I mean, like the tactics I used, it was like blackmail. I was trying to blackmail him to.
That's really interesting, though, because we talked about people learning things from those that are teaching them, and perhaps you have picked up a few things yourself from being in Bodenander's classes and around all of the people that have also been going through the School of Enlightenment.
Absolutely, yeah.
So once you finally get permission and you enroll, what does it look like? Is it like a daily thing? Are you supposed to practice things in your own time? How long is it before you meet Jay-Z Knight? Do you have to pay to enroll in the school?
Yeah. So the way it worked is that you had to go to a beginner event, and those were only held, I think, once or twice a year. So that year, then I finally went in April of 93 was when I finally went to my first event. And so, they kind of have it set up where you have to go to a beginning event. And once you've passed that beginning event, like passed, meaning attended it, then you're part of a certain group. Like we were given group names, and you have to sort of continue to fulfill certain requirements. So you have to go to your 2 required events a year to stay in that group. Otherwise, you have to start over from the beginning. And once you've done your beginner's event and then a follow-up in the fall, I think was how it was set up, then you were pretty much open and able to go to all the other events that happened throughout the year that might have been like, just evening events or weekend events or, scheduled, various times and such. And, but you had to basically do those first 2 requirements. And so when I went to my first beginner event, that's when you're like introduced to the whole philosophy about the school, and also sort of like the first background of like the quantum pseudoscience that supposedly supports the whole teachings. And you learn like the basic disciplines that kind of form the cornerstone of the school, which are like these breathing techniques, and we did other kinds of exercises and disciplines that were all meant to like hone your mind and like basically hone your focus. And the idea being that everything that happens in your mind, or really everything that exists outside of you in your world, is a reflection of what came before in your mind. So if that's true, big if, then the reverse is also true. So if you develop your mind the way you want it to be, eventually your outside world will reflect that as well. And so a lot of the disciplines were based on that, where we would spend time like focusing on whatever it was that we want or didn't want, and changing our brain chemistry essentially was the idea. And that would then be reflected on that in our lives.
How many people attended this first session with you?
I want to say there were like 300-400 people.
Well, okay.
So the hall where we had our events it held 1,000 people. And I don't remember it being full. I think it was like maybe half or a little less than half full. Yeah.
And every person is paying for this class.
Right. And the first retreat, oh gosh, I don't really fully remember, but I want to say it was like, the week-long retreats were close to $1,000, or maybe, I really don't remember, to be honest. But I don't think it was 1,000. Maybe it was like $450. I honestly don't remember, but it was several $100s.
So for a group that size to attend, and they do them twice a year, so that's a significant amount of income just from those 2 first initiation classes.
Yeah. I remember one time trying to calculate out like how much money she made at the events. And I just remember it was millions of dollars if you tried to add up all the people that went to the events that year, and, roughly estimate how much she was making. I just remember it was millions.
And do you meet Jay-Z Knight in person at these events, or is it very much sort of she is present, but it's not intimate?
Right. So the way it would work was that she, as Ramtha, would come out and like lecture and give lectures. And, it's very much, there isn't really any interaction. It's just that she would come out and give these teachings, basically. And that would be interspersed with us spending time practicing the disciplines. But ultimately, like during the retreats, you didn't really have a free moment. Like you would have a short break to get lunch or, get food or whatever. But it was like a constant. You were either getting lectured, for hours on end. I mean, sometimes it was up to, in the beginning, they don't start you out with these long lectures. So maybe it was 3-4 hours. But then, by the end, I remember some of our teachings would go 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours, just ongoing with almost no break. Like the only break would be like she would have to go and go to the bathroom or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Late into the night, and then starting with kind of different things at the break of dawn as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that was less common. Like the really long sessions were less common, but like 7-8 hours was not uncommon by the end. We were doing these crazy, sessions where we were also like drinking wine, and it kept going. It would just go on and on and on.
And you're staying with Bodhananda and his friends still at this point?
Yeah. Within a few months, though, I was kind of kicked out, and I had to figure out what I was going to do.
No way! What is this because you and Bodhananda stopped your romantic relationship?
Yeah, so he basically broke it off and sort of said that he felt like I wasn't in it, really, surprising. That's surprising.
Okay, so using that old... Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So instead of saying it's not you, it's me,
it's like, right, it's you.
Yeah, using the work against you, like, I'm more devoted than you are, and because of that, we can't be together because I'm so serious about my spiritual journey, and I'm so serious about my own, path to realizing that I am God. And because you're not as serious as me, or because you're not as devoted as me, it's not going to work after I've brought you all the way out here.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because, again, like how he justified things, because he sort of like then told himself this whole story about like, well, this was just about me bringing you out here. And, there's always like looking for this deeper meaning that, this was all just happened so that you could, I could bring you here. And, like as if it's some altruistic thing, as if like, he did something, that had nothing to do with what he gained out of it, but simply he did that so that I could be there.
And now that his job is done, he doesn't need to be with you anymore.
Yeah, I think it was more likely now that we're getting the hot water, because my dad sent like a restraining order and all kinds of things that, put the pressure on. Maybe he just got a little too sticky for him. I don't know. Plus, that is kind of like a manipulation tactic, right? It's like a way of testing your commitment, I mean, it was a way of like throwing me out like on my own to see if I would sink or swim. And given my personality, that I was not the kind to, leave with my tail between my legs, I was going to fight and figure it out. And so that is what I did.
And how did you manage that?
Honestly, it was really hard. I mean, I was kind of out on my own with zero tools and zero support. I didn't, feel like I could go back to my parents for help because they would just say, come back home. And I didn't want to do that. And so I was kind of just left to my own devices, and I ended up moving around a lot, like renting rooms here and there and just doing odd jobs. It was really, really difficult. yeah, some of the worst time I can remember. But
And when you're involved with the school at this level, is there like a recruitment or fundraising aspect that is put onto you? Are you expected to go out and encourage others to join? Are you expected to go out and raise money, or is it just through paying for the courses that is how the money is made for the school to continue?
right. So we did not have an element of recruitment, not officially. There was always this sort of underlying idea that if you were being the teachings, you would inspire other people to come and be curious about what it is that, you're doing. That is kind of like what happened with me and Bodhananda. I was inspired by his sort of confidence and charisma and all of that. And he said, well, that's from the school. So naturally, I want that. So I'm going to want to go there and figure out and find out what it is and do it myself so I can have that. And so that really is sort of like the underlying subtle way in which we weren't officially like told to go out and find other people. In fact, like on the surface, that was discouraged because, the idea is that people need to want to do this for themselves. So you weren't supposed to convince people that they should come or anything like that, which again is like a very clever way of making it seem like it's more benign than it is. Like, well, you're not being forced. You want to, you have to do this because you want to. And, but like kind of the same way that Bodhananda guided me into things that I supposedly wanted to do, it's like, there's all this, when you create this thing that's secret and, secret knowledge, of course people want that. Of course they want to find out what that is.
At one point during my discussion with your father, he mentioned that he was not in contact with you whatsoever, and you were still in contact with your mum. So he would phone her to find out if you were okay, and at least that way he knew that, she'd actually heard your voice, and even though he couldn't judge for himself what you sounded like on the other end of the phone, at least he knew from your mum that, you were alive and you were somewhat okay. He wondered whether his relationship with you was being thwarted from the inside because he felt like everything he tried wasn't working in terms of regaining some level of contact with you. And one thing that he mentioned that he said he's never asked you this, and he said, you'll have to ask Alexandra because I'm not sure. But he wondered if they were positioning it to you that his intent and his love for you was not a fatherly love, and it was different to a fatherly love. And that's how they were managing to keep you from regaining contact with him.
I mean, certainly they made it, they sort of twisted it in the sense that his actions were selfish, that they had nothing to do with what I wanted or recognizing me as a person or anything like that. And that he, part of the teachings was that, as you change and you become a new person, the people in your life aren't going to be able to cope with that because they only know you as the old person. And so, they can't handle you as this new person. And that's kind of a little bit of how it was turned, that somehow, he's just trying to hold me back to be that person that I used to be. Whereas I'm really developing into this new being that I now, am, and he's trying to thwart that basically. I think that was probably the extent of it. I don't think that there was anything like really like nefarious in that way, other than sort of like turning the way his concern from just a perfectly normal concern into like oh, he's trying to hold you back and, control you essentially.
From his position and having this distance from you and this no contact, I imagine every possible scenario must have gone through his mind, and he must have had so much time to try and figure out exactly what you were being told and what was being said to you to make you maintain this level of no contact with him. And I wonder if that is perhaps why he thought that this narrative may have existed, because of course to insinuate that he is abusive in some way or wants to abuse his relationship with you is possibly the worst thing that a parent can do to their child. So he must have thought, maybe, I'm just making assumptions here and I don't know if Bob will listen back to this, but perhaps he thought, the only thing that they must have convinced her of is that I want to harm her, and that's why I can't seem to regain some contact with my daughter. But he talked about sending you a Father's Day card, and that is what actually kind of started the process of you picking up communication again.
Right. So so from the time when I was about 18, when he finally did give me that permission, and I went to my first events and started going there, until I believe we didn't speak for 3 years. So from the time I was like 18 to 21. And throughout that time, he would try to reach out. He would send me cards. He would call, but I didn't return his calls. And I think I even at some point changed my number so he didn't have it. And, basically I ignored him. And eventually, but yes, he sent a card every holiday, every birthday, he always sent something. And finally, he sent me this Father's Day card. He is sending me.
Yep.
Sending him the Father's card, which was funny. And in that card, he had a picture. It had a picture of me on the phone, where it was a picture from when I was a kid, where I was standing in a phone booth holding the receiver, like I was on a call. And it was a cute little photo of me. And I think that's all it was. And he said, call me.
He said he taped a nickel inside the card or something like that.
Yes, he gave me the money to call him. Like, it was like, whatever it was, maybe it was a nickel to make a phone call. Right. I didn't even remember that, but that sounds right. And, it was cute. And at that point, I kind of had gotten over a lot of the anger that I felt. And I kind of, I think I just, my not speaking to him was in a way my way of establishing some control over the situation, where I felt I had no control, whether it was because of the experience that we had with the deprogramming or just the underlying experience of not having control over my life because of this environment I was in. And so it was misguided and misplaced on my dad. I think there was a combination of the two, but it gave me a way to feel like I was accepting something in my life and I was asserting myself and in control. And by the time I got that card, I kind of felt less of a need for that, I think. I felt more comfortable and confident in my life and what I was doing. And I'd become, a little more self-sufficient. And the other deciding thing at the time was I had a boyfriend who, he had lost his dad, like in a really tragic car accident. And, when he heard that I don't speak to my dad, and was like, are you crazy? Like, I would give anything to speak to my dad, and you're not talking to him by choice. And, he just kind of like expressed to me how painful that was for him not to be able to speak to his dad and see him anymore and have that relationship, and that he thought I was nuts for not taking advantage of, that connection when I have it. And I still remember one time, I think this was during the time that my dad was visiting and we went on that road trip. And we had like a dinner with everyone, like all my friends, and my dad was there too. And it was very tense and very uncomfortable. And my dad, I think, said something that was critical or, raised some issue that kind of made things very uncomfortable and tense. And after my dad left, everybody was sitting around and we were talking about it. And they were asking me, like, what is it you're afraid of? What are you afraid of? Kind of like, why don't you tell your dad off, basically, kind of thing. Like, why aren't you standing up for yourself and telling him that this is what you want? Or I don't, something along those lines. And I remember, thinking about it and again, trying to get to the root of what is it? Why am I afraid? And I remember what came to me was, I'm afraid that he's going to die. I'm afraid that he's going to die and I'm not going to figure this out with him before he dies. Like, that was my worst fear in that moment, was that I would miss a chance to make this right. Mm-hmm. And when I said, I'm afraid he's going to die, that was not the answer they expected at all. That was not what they thought. And as I remember, like, it kind of wasn't accepted. Like, it was like, no, that's not it. But I realized it. I realized, like, no. And what that told me was, like, I must know on some level that this is wrong. And I must know that I'm kind of like, I'm taking a really huge risk here, because what if he died and I didn't make up with him before he did? Then I wouldn't have that chance. And so even though this was years later when I got the Father's Day card, that in combination with, what my boyfriend had told me about missing his dad and all of that just sort of was like a perfect storm where I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to call him. And so I called him, and it was a little awkward and strained at first and didn't know what to talk about. And I think I was doing some kind of multi-level marketing business at the time. And he was definitely critical of that. Like, he questioned it and why I was into it and what was so special about these products I was selling, and which I didn't like because I didn't like that I was being questioned. But somehow we kind of reestablished contact through that.
I wonder if him sending you the card with the money, but not trying to contact you through the phone and leaving that decision with you, even though you've said that you needed control over your own decision making and power over your own decisions, but kind of felt less of a need for that at the time the card came. I wonder if maybe that was even the same thing. He's basically, he's giving you the olive branch, but he's not tracking down your new number or, he talked about camping out in the woods near where you were living at some point and just say, like, I'm here if you, I just want to show you that I could be in the area and so.
Did that? I don't remember that.
Yeah, I wonder if you'll listen to his episode and if there'll be parts of it that and things that happened that you were never aware of. But yeah, he talked about camping out near where you were living, like just so he could see you and know that you were okay. Here
he came up for like a surprise visit at Christmas. And I think this was before we were talking. He drove up and just wanted to spend Christmas together. And I remember I told him no. We did go out for like coffee or something. We had a meal together, but then I just told him no, I didn't want to see him. And basically, I think it was like Christmas Eve. And I was like, no, sorry. I think I might have said, well, you can come and spend Christmas with us, with all of us. And he was probably said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'd like to spend it with you. Let's go somewhere or something. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. So that was the end of that. But he was really upset. I remember he was so hurt and upset, I remember. And I did feel bad, but not bad enough, I guess. I think I was still in the process of punishing him. And so it was still a little while before, probably another year before we ended up speaking.
But again, with that card and that being the olive branch, the power for you to make that decision to actually call him, it still lies with you at that point. So that could have, maybe that was possibly the best thing that he did in terms of reestablishing communication, because he's not putting, well, maybe there's a certain level of pressure because he's reminding you that it's Father's Day and you're not talking to him, and, you know, he misses you and he's your father, and you know, there's certain customs that come with Mother's Day and Father's Day and all of these things. But again, he's not trying to find out your number and call you repeatedly. He's leaving that decision to call with you. So
Awesome. Yeah,
not only...
Right. I mean, that was a very smart, and, you know, I mean, it definitely, I think you're right. It was it was a way for me to I was taking control and deciding to reach out to him. And I think that was probably why it was so effective too.
And maybe the Father's Day card made you realize that you have a father, and actually maybe you do miss him a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I know that at the time, my friends tried to interpret this as though he was trying to guilt trip me and all these things, which I did feel some of that, you know, in his repeated attempts to reach out to me, that some of it felt like a guilt trip, even though I know it wasn't. But that's how they sort of tried to interpret it. And I just remember sort of feeling like, no, this isn't like that. Like, this was more like, you know, it was kind of humorous too. Like, he sent me a nickel so I could call him with this photo of me as a little kid on the, you know, tiny little kid in this big phone booth with a little, you know, with the receiver I could barely reach. And it was very cute.
And the interaction with your friends, where you arrive at the understanding of why you are worried about certain things with your father, and that, you know, he will pass away one day, and perhaps that will happen before you get the chance at reconciliation. And your friends are kind of saying, no, that's not the right answer. Again, it's that confession process that we were talking about earlier, but this time you didn't care if they thought that wasn't the right answer, because something inside you made you realize that you'd arrived at some sort of truth that felt real to you at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's funny because, like, looking back, there are a few moments like that I feel like were so critical and crucial in, like, making, you know, all kind of building up to cause the final sort of, you know, the final breakdown, or this, you know, how it all fell apart. But there are those moments that are so, like, they're so dramatic almost, you know, in how they affect you, and like a realization that made me sort of feel like that supported the doubts that I had. You know, somewhere in me there were always doubts, but we were told, you know, you weren't supposed to doubt, and that if you were doubting anything, that was something, a fault in you, and so you had to fix that and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there were these moments where things like that would happen, and it was like all of a sudden I felt my own, like you said, you know, you feel like something resonates, that is true, and it has nothing to do with what you're being told. It's like, it's your guts. It's your gut, essentially.
And we always say that if you get those feelings and those seeds of doubt, that it's okay to nurture them. It's okay to mull them over in your mind a little bit, and to see where that thought might take you, and to elaborate a little bit more on the idea of doubt, instead of pushing it away because it's something you've been taught or told is wrong to do. We always try to encourage that kind of small step into critical thinking when somebody starts to experience those things, if they are on their way out of their own high demand control group. So that's a very, very good point that you've raised there about kind of following your gut and understanding that those instincts are natural and they exist for a reason.
Right. And, you know, that part is so contrary to that sort of mental gymnastics that you do to justify all of the stuff that's going on. It's so opposite. And that's kind of like why I pointed out too, like how I think Bodhananda justified things to himself. You know, the same way you need to cultivate that intuition and the gut knowledge and knowing, being able to distinguish what is your gut and what is, worry, or what is just, influence or whatever. Like, you have to cultivate that. But part of this mental, stuff that we did in trying to justify and question and analyze and probe was totally the opposite, and like denied that part completely. And so that was what we were cultivating, was that mental process versus actually, like you said, the critical thinking and the sort of intuition and thoughts that if you carry them further might actually show you something.
And you mentioned that during your introduction into the school, there were things like reduced meal times where you would rush to eat to get back to the sessions, and maybe sort of a lack of a good night's sleep because the sessions ran so long and you were up early hours to start the next day. And these are just the introduction sessions. So is that kind of, and you were part of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So is this something you came accustomed to as time went on? Is that how the process worked for all of the sessions that you were involved in terms of the high demand of the environment?
Yeah, very much so. And it really became like, the more the further I got into it and the more sort of advanced I became, the more we had those kinds of sessions, like where, there were often times where we would go and do like the disciplines that we would do, and we would be, instructed to do it, but we didn't know how long it would go. So we were never told, you're going to do this for an hour or you're going to do this for 2 hours. We just had to keep going. That was part of the training, was to become so absorbed and so, fight that urge to like, jump out of your seat or, whatever it may be, but rather just keep going, because the whole philosophy was that if you are doing that, you're basically choosing that new neuro pathway. You're choosing and reinforcing this dream that you have, or whatever it may be that you're focusing on, over your body's needs, or your, we called it like your monkey mind, like your, the chatter that's going on in your head. You had to shut all that out and focus like single pointedly on the thing that you wanted. And that was how you were supposedly going to achieve those things. And so if a session went on for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, we were just expected to stick with it and, deal with all the stuff that came up and all of the, resistance and whatever it may be, and ultimately keep redirecting ourselves back to this focus, whatever it may be. And any kind of resistance or doubt or questions you have, it was your job to eliminate those and just choose something else. And so it's like part of what it makes it so insidious and effective, because you are doing that to yourself. Nobody is telling you to do that other than the directions, like here's, this is what we're doing, but nobody is really forcing you to sit there and do that. It's what you're doing to yourself in your own head.
I imagine having one thing to focus on and not being able to have the space to think or focus on anything else, first of all, sounds absolutely exhausting. Second of all, is not a way that people can typically function, I imagine, because even like I think about me with my kids, I think about, what they need for breakfast and what they need to get dressed and then like, so even if I just focus on the kids and everything that they need, you could break that down into specific things that they need that you need to focus on. But then also there's other things like the washing up and going to get petrol for the car and, going to see that friend that's having a really difficult time. So I don't feel like having one thing to focus on is feasible.
No.
If you have other responsibilities and things you have to take care of and lives that you are responsible for and these things, but also if you're applying those same practices outside of these sessions, I spoke to somebody else who was practicing a similar process, but when he tried to apply it to his everyday life, he ended up having a nervous breakdown because he couldn't fulfill the practice with all of the parts of his life that played out like a typical everyday experience. So I imagine that you also are exhausted from applying the work from the sessions to everyday life, but also that you become dependent on those mechanisms because then you don't know how to function without going through that process when it comes to, okay, so I really need to get this job. So I'm really going to focus on really doing the work so that I can bring this new opportunity into my life. And then the heartbreak that comes if you don't get that job. And again, we're back to mental gymnastics.
Oh, absolutely. And meanwhile, you're having this sort of, intense focus on holding this in your mind. Let's say, take that example of a job interview, and you're like, you have to basically imagine that you already have the job and all of this. And then you go into that job interview and you're just a weirdo, who can do that and come across as a genuine, normal human being? At least not I couldn't. I mean, it's like because you become kind of robotic. And definitely, I know people responded to me weirdly.
And you're part of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment for 10 years. So after a decade of being involved and given a significant portion of your life, you're about 26 at this time. So much of your life has been spent in this movement. You've moved and created your own life and a place where you live and friends and family and everything you've established over in Yelm in Washington. So what is it that makes you finally decide to walk away?
Yeah, so I finally, what was the final sort of straw was I met my ex-husband now, but at the time, we met there. And we met in, I think it was 2000. I fell really deeply in love, and we just, were super happy and really, felt so happy like I hadn't in I don't remember how long, and maybe ever, I don't know, but we had a really great relationship, and through that experience of sort of having something else that made me happy and allowing myself to sort of let some of the school aspect of me go a little bit, I think it sort of opened a little crack into that doubt, and it allowed the doubt to sort of come out a little bit more, where I wasn't spending my every waking moment trying to suppress the doubts, and plus I was back in touch with my dad, and, my dad continued to try to, I don't know what's the word, like inflame or spark the, my critical thinking. And he would say things that, sometimes made a lot of sense. And it was through those little things that happened that I think allowed me to sort of become a little bit more questioning. And ultimately, the final thing was September 11th. where, everything kind of went crazy, and there was so much chaos after that happened. And the way people reacted in the cult was madness. I mean, total madness. Like every conspiracy theory you can think of was thrown at us, like this is the end times that we've always talked about. And like, this is why you don't get on airplanes, and this is why you don't travel. And, don't listen to anything you're being told because they're just lying. And, but what happened for me was that it was like the first time that I actually did listen to the news, and I did listen to the radio, and I did like listen to what was going on. And I kind of saw how all of the stuff that we were being told in the school existed in a vacuum. So if you didn't know anything else outside of that, it was easy to accept it. But if you had some other perspectives, then it no longer made sense. And so I started to question those things based on some of the other perspectives I was seeing, like in the news and stuff. And for myself, it didn't jive anymore. Like, it just didn't make sense. Like, I don't believe what you're telling me here. It doesn't make sense. Like they told us that, that the whole, like the anthrax, when the anthrax thing happened, that, there were cans of oranges that were on the shelves that had anthrax in them because somebody had placed it there. And it was like, wait a minute, like that makes no sense whatsoever. If that were true, cans have a shelf life of like 5 to 10 years, right? I mean, they've been on the shelf for a long, long time. And we would have heard of people dying if that were true, right? And so just that little bit of critical thinking that then told me like that doesn't make any sense was met with like total, wow, you don't doubt what you're being told. You shouldn't be doubting what you're being told. And that more and more just didn't feel right to me. It felt like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that you should blindly, just take our word for it. Like, we have to question it. And through that, and then my dad also, the whole September 11th thing was crazy because my dad was actually scheduled to be on one of the planes that went down.
No way.
Yeah. And he was scheduled to fly that day, and he was supposed to be on one of the planes out of Boston. And when, he called me and we found out what had happened, and he was like, because we couldn't even speak to him for most of the morning. I think there were no phones, until maybe the afternoon. We couldn't get through to anybody. And finally he called me and he said, I'm okay. I don't think I had put together in my head that he was possibly going to be in one of those planes. But that's when he told me. I knew he was supposed to fly that morning. I just didn't put together that, he was going to be in one of those planes. But when he did tell me, it was another one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, can you imagine? Like, can you imagine? I couldn't imagine. And then, and what that did was it also made me sort of feel so much empathy and compassion for the people what they had been through, what they were going through, right? People who did lose that day. And that was like a new experience for me. I mean, like, you have to understand, like, we didn't do that in the cult. We didn't have compassion for people. We didn't put ourselves in other people's shoes. We believed that what happened to them because they basically made it happen. And so why would you feel sorry for them, or why would you feel compassion? Like, they did something that brought it upon them. And I could not accept that. It just did not jive with what I was experiencing. And I felt like, for the first time in I don't know how long, I was feeling like real pain and compassion for other people that I guess for me, it was so out of the norm that it was like extraordinarily painful. And I kind of realized that all of these other justifications were a way to avoid that pain. And I felt like that was, in a weird roundabout way, I felt that was contrary to the teachings. I felt like people weren't actually living what these teachings were that we were supposed to be feeling, living. And so I felt that I was justified in going against what most people were saying, because I felt like I was actually being more committed to these teachings, right? So it was a little bit of like a mind trick that I played on myself, where I justified to myself it was okay to question, because I was actually doing the right thing. And, even though on the surface it seemed like I was questioning the teachings, I was actually living the teachings more sincerely than anyone else,
My dad works with a very strict vegan.
Oh, yeah.
Who wears a leather belt. And my dad had this argument with this person about him wearing, he said, but you're wearing a leather belt. And he said, but you eat meat and you eat dairy. And my dad said, that's not what we're arguing here. We're talking about you being a strict vegan and condemning me for being a meat eater, but you're wearing a leather belt. So it's almost like your peers are claiming to practice something, but saying that you practice something and actually practicing something are two different things a lot of the time. And this is an example, this person that my dad works with, he says, I'm a strict vegan and you shouldn't eat meat. And then my dad says, well, we're not really that strict of a vegan, because look at the clothes that you wear. So that's there's so much in what you've just said as well that must have been so hard for you to, first of all, 9/11, I cannot even imagine the impact that had on civilians at the time, because we felt it over here. They sent us home from school. We had a teacher come in the classroom and say, kids, school's finished. It was like, it was nowhere near home time, but, they came in and they said, kids, we've phoned around the parents, it's time to go home. And we were kind of all a bit like, what, that only happens on snow days. School's only ever cancelled when there's heavy snow. What's going on? And we were too young to really comprehend the severity of what had happened. But to be a civilian over there, I imagine the impact. But then to find out that your father was supposed to be on one of those planes, and then to be told that it's a conspiracy, that nobody was on the planes, or that the planes were hijacked, or that the planes were full of dummies that weren't actual people, and all of these strange beliefs that came forward. How then if you were to believe that, you would then have to believe that your father was somehow involved in one of these conspiracies, because he, as somebody that you're not just talking about people whose names you've heard on the news who have never touched your life in any way. Even if you felt no compassion for those people and those families, which you said, you've already said that you did, it's so easy for people to disengage or desensitize themselves from other people's lives, to feel no empathy for or sympathy for people who you've never been in personal contact with. But how do you explain your father supposed to be on one of those planes and then to be told that it's a conspiracy somehow? And we're not just talking about conspiracy a way for America to infiltrate Afghanistan and Iraq for the oil. If they were talking about every conceivable conspiracy, there was some really wild things that were thrown out there about what happened around 9/11. And your response to that sounds almost like your father's response to finding out about you and Bodhananda. Everybody's talking about these conspiracies, and you kind of had this snap moment where you have your fight, flight, or freeze moment where you say, hang on a minute, wait, what? How are we saying that this is not a tragedy? How are you using this to further instill fear into your followers so that they'll pay for more sessions and come back for more workshops and learn how to protect themselves more, because we're all at risk now of being pulled into this conspiracy one way or another?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for them to say that, the orange the cans of oranges have been spiked and they're living on the shelves, and then for you to say, well, we would hear about that, and then for them to say, don't question.
Right.
How can you doubt or question? You know, at this point, I remember watching a Forensic Files episode where there was unpasteurized apple juice being sold on the shelves, and I think some people actually died from, and it took them ages to track it back to where and I'm sure this was in the 90s, it took them ages to track it back to the cause and where it came from, and it was a manufacturing problem in the end, and it was E. coli that was in the juice from the unpasteurized ingredients that we used. But then you've also had the Rajneesh incident at this point, where salad bars have been purposefully dosed in salmonella, which has been grown in a lab on the ranch and used to purposefully make people sick. So,
Yeah.
of course you would hear about it, because these things have happened and we've already heard about them happening. So if people were being spiked by oranges in cans, if they can trace it back in the 90s to a manufacturing plant miles away in the 90s, they can do that.
Yeah.
The oranges.
Right.
When you hear about it. So you're right to say, hang on a minute, that didn't make sense.
Right. And the other part of it was that supposedly the risk from anthrax was inhaling it, not ingesting it. So it was like, why? But then the question is like, why make up this bullshit? You know, like, why make it up? It just makes no sense, other than to show that you will believe anything. You know, to reinforce that we can tell you whatever the hell we want and you are going to believe it because we said so. And yeah, something clicked and it just went, no, I don't buy it. And then the other part of it was that having sort of that moment, which kind of took me back to where, like, oh my gosh, my worst fear was that my dad was going to die. You know, it felt almost like another moment where, like, oh my gosh, he might have died, but he didn't, thankfully. And it made me feel like I want to, you know, all of a sudden, for the first time, I wanted to travel. I wanted to see my family, which I hadn't done for years, probably 5 years. I hadn't really been anywhere. And because we were discouraged from traveling, and that was dangerous and scary in the outside world and all of that. And so it really just sort of pushed me and my husband at the time to say, like, you know what, we want to get out there and we want to live. Like, life could be over any second and we want to live.
I suppose it really puts into perspective your mortality after the events of 9/11, and you realize that perhaps there is more to existing than focusing on one thing at a time and putting all of those practices from the school into place, when you could have simply boarded one of those planes that day and all of that work would have been for nothing anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my goodness. Wow. And your father never mentioned that. He never mentioned that he was supposed to be on one of those planes. Wow. That's wild.
The reason he wasn't was that it was a really early flight. So I think those planes left Boston around 8 a.m. And he would have had to leave New York, where he was, at like 6 a.m. to get to his flight. And he just decided, like, he wasn't going to ask his mom to drive him to the airport at that time. Like, it was just a fluke, sort of like, I'll take the next flight. And, like, what a minute little decision that changed everything, you know?
And it speaks to your father's personality so much, because he didn't want to put his own mum out of her way by asking her to get up early and get him to the airport and stuff. So, you know.
Well, we're not morning people. That's a bit.
No, I think morning people are in cults anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I that's a generic statement. I'm not a morning person myself, and with kids you have to be. So I'm begrudgingly a morning person at the moment. But yeah. So you're part of the school for 10 years. A series of events lead to you becoming somewhat disenchanted with the movement, And so you leave with your husband, but it takes another 5 years for you to identify that the Ramtha School of Enlightenment has cult-like methods of control, coercion, and practices.
Yeah. It was very interesting that I didn't put all that together. I only, after leaving, it was a really chaotic time for me, like emotionally, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Like I never really pinpointed why. And I think, in retrospect, it was because my world fell apart. Like my whole worldview fell apart. And, but I was used to just dealing with it. I was used to just dealing with whatever was going on, kind of like in constant crisis mode. And so I didn't really think much of it, and I didn't pinpoint what was going on. And I had no like education, psychoeducation on it. So I really just sort of thought, well, I did this and now I'm not doing it anymore and I'm just moving on. And it wasn't until about 5 years later, I was we had moved away from that area, still in Washington, but Eastern Washington. And I had a good friend, and she kept talking about having been in a cult. And she kept talking about, and then I got out of this cult, and we were in this cult, and we left. And then finally I was like, what was that? What made it a cult? Why would you call it a cult? And so she finally sort of explained that she was in this, hers was like a family Christian kind of cult. But when she explained the dynamics of having to follow certain rules, and if you stepped outside of that, you were considered like a sinner, or, you were questioned, and yet at the same time, you weren't allowed to question anything. And something about the way she explained the dynamics that were going on at the time in her situation made me realize, holy shit, I was in a cult. I was like, this is so familiar to me. I can so relate to what you're telling me right now. I think I was in one of those, And it was like an aha moment, and like a light bulb went on, and it made me like rethink everything, my relationship with Bodhananda, everything that we had learned, whereas I had kind of left it, a little bit in my mind, like, well, maybe they're not doing something great, but what do I care? What do I care? I'm not doing it anymore, so who cares? It's kind of like the same mentality of being in the cult, where it's like, well, they're creating their reality. Why should I care? Like, you're almost taught to like not take an interest in other people's choices and lives because, it's none of your business, or it's, their own doing. So why care? All of a sudden that like protective mechanism like fell away, and I was like questioning it and realizing that I had been in a situation where I was influenced, and I was young, and I was, pressured. And I just started questioning all of it and realized that happened to me.
Did you take that revelation to your husband and your father? And did they have sort of a reaction to you kind of putting a label on your experience?
I don't remember telling my dad, but I think I did tell my husband. Or maybe I did tell my dad. Eventually I think I did. I know that early on, when we had left the cult, my dad at some point offered to me, he said, if you ever want to talk to somebody about your experiences, I know somebody who has experience with these types of groups, and it's not in cults. I think he might have even said cults. And at the time I was like, well, I wasn't in a cult. Why should I do that? I don't care. I'm fine, totally fine. And I wasn't fine at all, but I thought, I was just being tough. And when I had that realization, and I sort of like rethought all of those things, and I think for the first time, I also sort of questioned the whole, like my age and how Bodhananda, took advantage, and which I had up until a time just not questioned and just left to be like, oh, well, it is what it is. And I did talk to a friend at the time who had been in the cult, but she was no longer in it. But I don't think she had the same realizations that I had had. And when I brought it up to her, I felt like she was justifying. She wasn't hearing what I was saying. You know, she wasn't hearing that I was saying it affected me negatively. And I remember how upset that made me. Like, it made me really upset that I felt like I wasn't being acknowledged and heard. And, you know, but part of it was that I couldn't really put my finger on what was bothering me or why I was so upset. And so I couldn't really articulate like what was wrong. But it was like an internal process of sort of figuring out like why, you know, it made me realize that I had to question everything. Like, I had to question everything that I thought had been me up until that point. Like, everything that I thought I had gained and I thought I had grown from and taken as like my own personality, and then realized like maybe it isn't. And I ended up having severe PTSD, like to the point that I couldn't make any decisions. Like, I just couldn't decide. Like, I couldn't decide what to eat at a restaurant because I think part of it was like I was so afraid of making the wrong choice because I felt I had failed myself with the choices I had made before. And of course, like, none of that was me conscious. It was just I felt frozen and like I couldn't do anything. And that's when I sort of remembered that my dad had told me years before that he knew somebody that I might be able to speak to. And that's when I started going to therapy and seeing someone, you know, specifically about the cult experience. And it was kind of for me about like, and I'm still doing that, picking apart like what was good and what was not, you know, what do I take from it that I conclude that I'm, you know, is still a part of me and is okay. And yeah, trying to put like words to the things that bothered me about it. And I feel like I'm still doing that. I feel like I'm still figuring that out. And I feel like internally I've processed a lot, but I don't necessarily know how to articulate that other than sort of like an internal knowing, you know? Yeah, so it's still a process.
I feel that often when we have these discussions on this show and people come away from the group that they've been involved in or grown up in, that they can't quite put their finger on why it is that they are so upset and sad. And I think a lot of the time it comes down to grief. You're in mourning. You're mourning not only, you know, the 10 years of your life that you've put into this, you're mourning, you know, what you're leaving behind and what you've built and the person that you were and the person that you were before you joined, the person you were during, and all of those things. And I think because there hasn't been a physical person in your life that's passed away where you have a funeral and, you know, you go through the customs of you know, when a loved one passes away, because that hasn't happened and there's no process that goes with it, it's often hard to put your finger on what that is. But sometimes I feel like people, what they describe is that they are in mourning and they are grieving and they can't quite put their finger on what it is. So when they try to explain it to family and friends and they're not understood, it's often because they don't realize themselves that maybe that's what's happening. And I'm not saying that that's what happened with you, but when it was just the way that you said you were so sad and you couldn't quite put your finger on why it was that you were feeling that way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, especially, you know, to some degree, that was literally happening to me, where I was feeling like I missed all these years of my life. Like for the first time, I think I was experiencing the consequences of having not finished school, not gone to college, living a life of constant struggle, even though at that time, like, things had gotten a little bit better because my ex-husband had gotten a really good job, but still, I felt like there was a huge gap in my knowledge, in my, social skills, in, I feel like I missed the entire 90s. I mean, to this day, there are certain references I just simply don't get. And, I feel really left out, But and I realized that I felt mad about it. I was mad that I had been robbed of that time, and I remember expressing that to this friend who had been in the cult as well, and hearing the justifications of like, well, if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be where you are now. And like, kind of like everything that you did before brought you to where you are now. It was like, no, that's not good enough. Like, I am entitled to be angry about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Angry about this and feel that loss because it's real. There are certain things you don't get back. You just don't, you can never get those years back. You can never get that, especially for me, like that developmental time where I would have been building certain things like, certain just life experience and building things up for me to be able to thrive from. I missed it. I felt almost like I stopped developing and then I picked up again. And so in some ways, I feel like developmentally, I'm 10 years younger, I mean, I think I caught up a little bit, but for a while, I felt that way. I felt like I had missed out on something that I needed to catch up on developmentally.
And you have a daughter who is 18 now. So I suppose an interesting question for me to ask you is how you think you'd react if your daughter was to try and do the same things to you that you did to your father.
Oh my God, I would be devastated. I would go insane. I would completely, I feel that I'm somewhat thankful and grateful that she's made it to 18 without doing some of the things that I did. I mean, but that doesn't mean that couldn't still happen to her. I mean, it's, I don't feel, this is one thing that I feel like I've come out of this experience with. I don't feel you're ever safe. I don't feel, I mean, maybe that's kind of sad and scary, but I don't feel that anyone is ever safe from this sort of thing happening to them. I don't care how smart and educated or supported you think you are. Like, I feel like this can happen to anyone given the right circumstances and the right vulnerabilities, which I feel is what I experienced, and then for just a person coming in and, I think when you've had an experience like that, innately, like, this could happen to anybody. And I even know it could happen to me again. I don't feel like I am immune to it either, except that maybe my radar is a little more finely tuned. But I also know from experience that anytime I'm going through a transition or some kind of, upheaval in my life, I am extremely vulnerable. And so I guess my antenna are up for that.
That is incredible that you've just said that. We definitely try and make a point on this show when we get the opportunity to mention that the stigma that comes with, air quotes, the type of person that joins a cult, that there is no type of person. And your dad summed it up perfectly when he said, if you speak to the right person at the right time, you're done for. That's it. If they get you,
yeah,
and they speak to you, and if you're in, like you just said, one of those transitional periods or a state of upheaval, or you've lost a loved one, or, there's a significant shift in your life and you're vulnerable in any way, that's it. Yeah. And the way that he said that, I was like, wow, yeah, that's exactly it. You could have all the doctorates and degrees in the world or all the experience with coercion and cults in the world. But, you've even mentioned there that you were working under some type of MLM whilst being in the school of Enlightenment. So where does it end? Where does it stop? It's just, it's definitely interesting to see your reaction to the question of what you would do if your daughter came to you and said, Mum, I'm moving across the country with a man of this age to go join the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and you said that you'd probably just go insane. And I wonder if you feel like you'd be able to react to it the way that your father did, or if you would react to it completely differently, because I understand he tried a few things that for you at the time felt like an invasion, or a break in the trust that you had for him. But I feel like when he spoke to us, he did everything in his power that he could think to do, whether it was to ambush you or to send you the Father's Day card. He did everything in his power possible to try and get you back.
Yeah. And, you know, I think I would do the same thing. I would do exactly the same thing. And I would do everything that I possibly could. And I would adjust the same way that he did, you know, like, well, this isn't working. Now I got to try something else. I feel like I've done that with my daughter in different circumstances where it's like, okay, well, this parenting strategy isn't working. I think we need to try something else, you know, because you don't know how your actions are going to be perceived by your kid and how they're going to respond. And you have to be flexible and work with it and figure it out. And I would hope if something like that would happen with my daughter, that she would be open to listening to me. But I know from experience that the whole nature of somebody being under an influence like that is that they are not open, and that they're not able, they're literally not able to function normally. And so I think it would be devastating, and I would be heartbroken, and I would never give up trying to reach her. But I know that there's certain realities to when somebody is in that state that make things impossible. And that's why I think it's so hard for the loved ones of people who are in cults and situations, you know, these control situations, because you don't have any control and you can't do anything about it.
And that's absolutely one of the reasons why this segment has focused on your relationship with your father and his perspective on your experiences, more than focusing solely on the School of Enlightenment, because given the opportunity to speak to the two of you and compare your experiences and how you both felt and thought at those same times, I feel it's a more important message to explore with you and to give to the listeners, in case any of them are listening and have loved ones themselves involved in similar situations, and the loved ones are struggling to reach that loved one, and are kind of at a loss of what to do in order to support that loved one. And so when I first got in touch with your father and he explained the situation to me, I felt like it would be better to explore that than to focus too much on the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. But I do also feel like we've covered enough of the school to pinpoint some cult-like methods of control that are being implemented in the system to hopefully deter anyone thinking about enrolling or becoming involved, especially as you're still working today on putting yourself together and realizing who you are and the way you think and feel separate to the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, whilst also understanding that that is part of your life, and it's not something that you can detach yourself from completely, because you spent so much of your life enrolled in the school. So it's definitely been insightful to have that conversation with you and your father. So I guess the last question that I have for you before I ask you if there's anything you think we've missed today is to ask you what advice you would give to others who have experienced a high demand group themselves, but also to those who have loved ones that may be involved with high demand groups.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like similar to what we're talking about, like all the things my dad tried, it may come down to you got to just keep trying different things and find what works. But I think it's important to talk about what you've experienced with someone, whether it's an expert or family, friends. But primarily, I think what's important is talking about it where you can be heard and understood. So talking to other people who've been through what you've been through, where you are understood. So you don't have to, you don't feel like you have to explain yourself too much. Like there's just sort of like an understanding that people have that have been through something similar or who have experience with it and understanding of it, versus having to convince people of your experience. And that can be like re-traumatizing, because it's really important to be understood, because it's healing. It heals, and it helps to validate like what you went through that was wrong. So I would say talking to someone, also just being patient with yourselves and understanding that, what happened isn't your fault.
Absolutely.
And living with the consequences is a burden and a responsibility that you have to live with and navigate, and you don't have to be perfect. You'll figure it out, and you'll sort of come to a place of peace about it eventually.
I think that's absolutely wonderful advice to give to people. Patience, don't blame yourself, talk to people, and understand that not everybody is going to judge you for talking to them about your experiences, and not everybody is out to have that gotcha moment with you where you say, I was in a cult, and somebody says, what do you mean you're in a cult? And you say, well, this happened to me. And then, if you're talking to somebody that is respectful and trustworthy, and somebody who is actively listening instead of passively listening, then they shouldn't turn around and say, oh, well, you weren't in a cult because a cult is Charles Manson. It's much more in depth than that. And hopefully the people that we surround ourselves with, that we trust. And I know that we have never met before, so it's hard for me to say, like, talk to people that you know and trust, because that's kind of going against what I'm doing here today. But people that respect you shouldn't need you to explain why that happened. There shouldn't be a, yes, got you moment, because that's not what comes with people listening and understanding. So hopefully the people that we do talk to and open up to can just listen and understand without needing proof or reasons for why things happened and how they happened, because they're your experiences and you're not making them up, and you know that they happened because you can remember them and you can still feel them. So hopefully people can respect that and not question your story, because you're just relaying it from the way that you've lived it. And hopefully people can take that from our episode and apply that to themselves, to keep open those lines of communication with loved ones involved in these types of situations, like your father spoke to with me. And it got quite emotional towards the end of my interview with your father, and I told him I need to go and have a glass of wine now. So I don't know if you listen to that episode, it might be a bit difficult at times for you to listen to some of the things that he said, but it was genuinely heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. So hopefully this segment can give a new perspective to some of the listeners on how to explore and understand their own situations, but also how to support loved ones and understand them as well. And then the takeaway from what you've just said there at the end is to be patient with yourself, don't blame yourself, and find somebody to talk to that you can trust. So I think that kind of sums everything up in a nice, tidy little bundle. And just thank you so much for your time today, Alexandra. I really, really appreciate it. I feel so privileged to have had this interaction with you and your father. I feel like I've really gained some deep insight into the whole situation, and I just really appreciate your time and respect you and your father so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you letting me tell the story, and your willingness to sort of educate other people on it. I think it's so important, and I think who knows, it may not be the magic bullet, but I think education is important. And if we all sort of understood these kind of, dynamics better in relationships and coercion, I think it might go a long way at sort of, safe-proofing our lives from these experiences. Although, like I said before, I think it can happen at any time, but maybe the more others around us are educated as well, we can help each other out and avoid these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to log off, but thank you so much, Alexandra. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed the last of this year's episodes. You can get in touch by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, signing out for 2021, and this has been the Cult Vault.